Desmond put 80% of his savings into a single stock, because he'd read about someone who turned $5,000 into $500,000 doing exactly that. He didn't read about the other people, not because they were hidden from him on purpose, because they simply never wrote the article. Nobody publishes "I concentrated my life savings into one stock and lost most of it." The same way nobody builds a highlight reel out of a bet that didn't pay off. The story only gets told by the people it happened to work out for, which creates a very specific, very dangerous illusion about how often it actually does. This has a name, and one of the clearest illustrations of it comes from a true story that has nothing to do with money at all. During World War II, the military asked a statistician named Abraham Wald to help solve a real problem. Bombers were returning from missions covered in bullet holes, and the military wanted to know where to add armor to help more of them survive. Engineers studied the returning planes carefully, mapped every bullet hole, and found the damage clustered heavily around the wings, the tail, and the body of the fuselage. The obvious recommendation was to armor those exact areas, since that's clearly where the planes were getting hit hardest. It's worth sitting with how reasonable that engineering recommendation actually sounded at the time. Nobody involved was being careless or unintelligent. They had real data, carefully collected, showing a clear, consistent pattern. Adding armor exactly where the damage was concentrated is precisely what good, disciplined data analysis would normally recommend. The recommendation was wrong for a much subtler reason than bad analysis. It was wrong because of which planes were available to analyze in the first place. Wald said no. Armor the engines instead, one of the few areas on the returning planes that had almost no bullet holes at all. His reasoning was the entire insight. And once you hear it, it becomes almost impossible to unsee. The planes being studied were the ones that made it back. Bullet holes in the wings and fuselage weren't the most dangerous damage. They were the damage a plane could apparently survive, since here it was, safely landed, covered in exactly that kind of damage. The planes hit in the engines never made it back to be studied at all. Their absence from the data wasn't an absence of danger. It was the most dangerous finding in the entire data set. Invisible precisely because it had been fatal. This is survivorship bias, and it's not really about statistics. It's about which stories are even physically capable of reaching you in the first place. You cannot interview a plane that didn't return. You cannot read a triumphant blog post from someone whose concentrated bet quietly wiped out their savings, and who now, understandably, doesn't feel like publicizing it. The failures aren't rare. They're just silent. Systematically. Every single time. Which makes any pool of visible stories a wildly distorted sample of what actually tends to happen. The word survivorship is doing precise, deliberate work in that name. And it's worth taking literally, rather than just as a catchy label. It isn't describing a bias about optimism, or about greed, or about any particular character flaw. It's describing a structural fact about which outcomes are even present in the room to begin with. You could be the most careful, most skeptical, most rigorously honest thinker in the world, and still draw a badly wrong conclusion, simply because the only data physically available to you had already been filtered by who survived long enough to tell the story. Desmond's $500,000 success story was completely real. That's actually what makes this so dangerous. Nobody had to lie or exaggerate anything for the illusion to work. The story was true. It just wasn't representative. And nothing about reading it, honestly and carefully, would have revealed that on its own. Because the missing data wasn't hidden in the story. It was hidden by the simple fact that failure doesn't get written up nearly as often as success does. Here's the actual scale of what's usually missing. For every investor who concentrates heavily in one stock and gets rich, research on concentrated stock positions consistently finds a much larger number who concentrate the same way and end up significantly worse off than if they'd simply spread the same money across a diversified set of investments. The diversified approach doesn't produce dramatic stories in either direction. No one writes an article titled, "I owned a normal, boring index fund and got a normal, boring return," even though that outcome is, for most people, both the most likely and the healthiest one. Boring outcomes don't generate content. Extreme outcomes do. In both directions. But only one direction tends to get celebrated loudly enough to actually spread. This creates a strange, almost backwards relationship between how often something works and how often you hear about it. The riskier and more concentrated a strategy is, the wider the range of possible outcomes it produces. Which means it generates both more spectacular successes and more devastating failures than a boring, diversified approach ever could. But only the spectacular successes get amplified into content anyone actually sees, which means the riskiest strategies end up looking, from the outside, disproportionately more impressive than they actually are on average. Precisely because their failures are the ones most thoroughly buried by silence. This is what makes survivorship bias so much more dangerous in finance, specifically, than in most other areas of life. The visible sample isn't just incomplete. It's actively selected for the exact stories most likely to encourage risky imitation, while the stories that would most effectively discourage it are the ones least likely to ever get told. Desmond didn't do anything irrational. Exactly. Reading a true story and updating your beliefs based on it is normally a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The problem was never the reasoning. It was the sample the reasoning got applied to a sample that had already been filtered, invisibly, by the same mechanism that kept Wald's engine-damaged bombers out of the wartime dataset entirely. So here's the actual fix. And it's the same one Wald essentially discovered by asking a single, uncomfortable question. What does the data look like if I also count the planes that didn't come back? Before making any decision based on someone else's visible success. The question worth asking isn't, did this work for them? It's how many people tried this exact same approach. And how many of them are we simply not hearing from? That second group is always larger than it looks. And it's always the harder one to find. Precisely because silence doesn't show up in a search result the way a viral success story does. Desmond eventually looked for that second group directly. Instead of relying on whatever came up first, it took some searching. Because failure genuinely is harder to find than success forums, instead of headlines. Quiet threads, instead of highlight reels, but the pattern, once visible, was unmistakable. For every story like the one that convinced him, there were many more describing the same concentrated bet, ending very differently. Sitting exactly where you'd expect them to sit, unpublicized, and functionally invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for them. Desmond didn't abandon the stock entirely. He resized the position down to a small percentage of his total savings, keeping the upside available without keeping his entire financial future tied to a single outcome. The story that convinced him was still true. It just stopped being the only story counted, which turned out to be the entire difference between a reasonable bet and a dangerous one. There's a broader habit worth taking from Wald's engines beyond just this one stock decision. Almost any time a strategy, a plan, or an approach is being judged entirely by examples of people who tried it. The question worth asking automatically, every time, is where the people who tried it and failed actually went. Sometimes they're easy to find, once you look. Sometimes an entire category of failure barely leaves a trace at all. Which is exactly when the visible success stories are most likely to be quietly lying about the real odds, without a single one of them containing an actual lie. If this changed how you think about the success stories you've been learning from, subscribe, because we'll keep telling these stories, the psychology first, the money second. The same way we always have. Same honest stories. Same simple truth. See you in the next one.